James Clark Jr. was born on 4th of March 1936 and died today, 7th of April 1968. He was a British Formula One racing driver from Scotland who won 2 World Championships in 1963 and 1965. A versatile driver, he competed in sports car, touring cars and in the Indianapolis 500, which he won in 1965. He was particularly associated with the Lotus Marque. Clark was killed in a Formula 2 racing accident in 1968 in Hockenheim, West Germany. At the time of his death, aged 32, he had won more Grand Prix races, 25, and achieved more Grand Prix pole positions, 33, than any other driver. In 2009, The Times, the magazine, placed Clark at the top of a list of the greatest ever Formula One drivers. He was active between 1960 and 1968, mainly for the Team Lotus, with 73 entries, 72 starts, 2 championships, 63 and 65, 25 wins, 32 podiums, 255 career points, with 33 pole positions, 28 fastest laps, and an incredible record of performances and of epic races that will forever put him within the greatest. He was born into a farming family at Kilmany House Farm, Fife, the youngest child of 5 and the only boy. He was educated at primary schools in Kilmany and then in Churnside. Following 3 years of preparatory schooling at Clifton Hall School in Edinburgh, he was sent to Loreto School in Musselburgh, East Lothian. Although his parents were opposed to the idea, Clark started his racing career in a local road rally and hill climb events, driving his own Sunbeam Talbot, and proved a fearsome competitor right from the start. On 16 June 1956, in his very first event, he was behind the wheel of a DKW Sonderklasse at Crymont, Scotland. By 58, Clark was driving for the local Border Rivers team for Ian Scott Watson, racing Jaguar D-types and Porsches in national events, winning 18 races. Then, on Boxing Day 1958, Clark raced against the man who would launch him to superstardom. Driving a Lotus Elite, he finished second to a certain name called Colin Chapman in a 10-lap Grand Tourers race at Brands Hatch. In 59, he drove a Lotus Elite, finishing 10th at the Le Mans 24 hours race, partnered with John Whitmore and the ex-Bruce Alford Lister Jaguar, winning the Bowness Hill climb. Chapman was sufficiently impressed to give Jim Clark a ride in one of his Formula Junior cars. In March 1960, the first race for the newly introduced Formula Junior took place at Goodwood. Who was the winner? Obviously, Jim Clark, ahead of John Surtees with a Cooper and Trevor Taylor with another Lotus Ford, finishing third. Clark had made an earlier Formula Junior appearance in a one-off race at Brands Hatch on Boxing Day 59, driving a Gemini BMC for Graham Warner of the Checkered Flag Garage. Jim made his Formula One Grand Prix debut partway through the season at the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort on 6 June 1960. Lotus had lost John Surtees, as he had gone to the Isle of Man to do some serious motorcycle racing. So they had Ireland, Stacey and Clark, the last name being an acceptable substitute. Unluckily, he retired on lap 49 with final drive failure. His second Formula One race was the 1960 Belgian Grand Prix, held at the extremely fast and dangerous Spa-Francorchamps circuit. There, he got a taste of reality when 2 fatal accidents occurred, Chris Bristol and Alan Stacey. Clark was later quoted as saying in a 64 interview, "I was driving scared stiff pretty much all through the race," even though he finished 5th and scored his first points finish. The next year, Clark was involved in one of the worst accidents in the history of Formula One racing. In the 1961 Italian Grand Prix on 10th of September at Monza, Wolfgang von Trips in his Ferrari collided with Clark's Lotus. Von Trips' car became airborne and crashed into a side barrier, fatally throwing Von Trips out of the car and killing 15 spectators. His first Drivers' World Championship came driving the Lotus 25 in 1963, winning 7 out of the 10 races and Lotus its first Constructors' World Championship. Clark's record of 7 wins in a season was not equaled until 1984, when Frenchman Alain Prost won 7 races for McLaren, and was not broken until Brazilian Ayrton Senna won 8 races in the 1988 season, also for McLaren. Senna's teammate that year was Prost, who again equaled the old record by winning 7 races. However, Clark's record is favorable compared to Prost and Senna's, as the 1963 championship only consisted of 10 rounds, giving Clark a 70% success rate, while 84 and 88 seasons were run over 16 rounds, giving Prost a success rate of 43.7 and Senna a 50% winning ratio. In 1963, he raced in his first Indianapolis 500 and finished in 2nd position behind Parnelli Jones and won also the Rookie of the Year honors. In 1964, Clark came within just a few laps of retaining his World Championship crown, but just as in '62, an oil leak from the engine robbed him of the title, this time conceding it to John Surtees with Ferrari. Tire failure damaging the Lotus suspension put paid to that year's attempt at the Indianapolis 500. He made amends and won the championship again in '65 and also Indianapolis 500, driving the Lotus 38. To race at Indianapolis, he had to miss the prestigious Monaco Grand Prix to compete, but made history by driving the first mid-engined car to win at the fabled Brickyard, as well as becoming the only driver to date to win both the Indy 500 and the Formula One title in the same year. Other drivers, including Graham Hill, Mario Andretti, Emerson Fittipaldi and Jacques Villeneuve, have also won both crowns, but not in the same year. At the same time, Clark was competing in the Australasia-based Tasman Series, run for older Formula One cars, and was series champion in '65, '67 and '68, driving for Lotus. He won 14 races in all, a record for the series, and this included winning the '68 Australian Grand Prix at the Sandown International Raceway in Melbourne, where he defeated the Ferrari 246T of Chris Amon by just 0.1 seconds after 55 laps. That was the closest finish in the history of the Australian Grand Prix. The 1968 Tasman Series and Australian Grand Prix would prove to be his last major wins before his untimely death. According to Australian driver and regular Tasman Series driver Leo Geoghegan, during his time down under for the '67 series, Clark arrived at the Sydney home that Leo shared with his parents and his younger brother Jan Piet. Neither Leo, Piet, or their father Tom were home at the time, but the mother of Leo, wife of his father Tom, was there. She didn't know actually who Clark was, and so she thought that he was there to mow their lawns and told him that the mower was in the shed and he could start at any time. When Leo, Piet and their father Tom arrived home, a short time later, they were surprised to find a shirtless Clark casually mowing their front lawn. Crazy times, huh? The FIA decreed from season 1966 a new 3 liters engine regulations would come into force. Lotus were less competitive, starting with a 2 liters Coventry Climax engine in the Lotus 33. Clark did not score points until the British Grand Prix and a third place at the following Dutch Grand Prix. From the Italian Grand Prix onwards, Lotus used the highly complex BRM H16 engine in the Lotus 43 car, with which Clark won the US Grand Prix. He also picked up another second place at the Indianapolis 500, this time behind Graham Hill. During 1967, Lotus and Clark used three completely different cars and engines. The Lotus 43 performed poorly at the opening South African Grand Prix, so Clark used an old Lotus 33 at the following Monaco Grand Prix, retiring with suspension failure. Lotus then began its fruitful association with Ford Cosworth. Their first car, the Lotus 49, featuring the most successful F1 engine in history, the Ford Cosworth DFV, won its first race at the Dutch Grand Prix, driven by Clark. He won with it again at the British, United States and Mexican Grand Prix, and in January 1968 at the South African Grand Prix. From a performance point of view, there are days that for sure will be remembered in an incredible way for what Jim Clark delivered. He won the 1963 Belgian Grand Prix at Spa-Francorchamps in extremely foggy and rainy conditions. After starting 8th on the grid, passed all of the cars in front of him, including early leader Graham Hill. About 17 laps into the race, with the rain coming down harder than ever, Clark had lapped the entire field except for Bruce McLaren, and was almost 5 minutes ahead of McLaren and his Cooper. This would be the first of 7 victories for Clark and Team Lotus that year. In the 1967 Italian Grand Prix at Monza, after starting from pole position, Clark was leading in his Lotus 49 chassis R2 when a tire punctured. He lost a lap while having the wheel changed in the pits. Rejoining 16th, he advanced through the field, progressively lowering the lap record and eventually equaling his pole position time of 1 minute 28 seconds, 0.5, to regain the lost lap and the lead. He was narrowly ahead of Brabham and Surtees starting the last lap, but his car has not been filled with enough fuel. It faltered and finally coasted across the finish line in 3rd place. In his Indianapolis 500 win, Clark led 190 of the 200 laps, with a then record average speed over 150 miles per hour, 240 kilometers per hour, to become the first non-American in almost half a century to win the race. In the 2 seasons, 63 and 65 Formula 1, Clark equaled Alberto Ascari's record for the highest percentage of possible championship points in a season, normally 100%. Leading 71.4 of the laps in 63, Clark holds the record for the highest percentage of laps in the lead in a season. He also holds the record for most races taking pole position, fastest lap, race win, and leading every lap, achieving this 8 times: in the 62 at the British Grand Prix, in the 63 at the Dutch Grand Prix, which he won by more than a full lap, in the same year, 63, again at the French Grand Prix and the Mexican Grand Prix one, in 1964 at the British Grand Prix, 65 South African and French Grand Prix, and at the end, 65 German Grand Prix. On 7th of April 1968, Clark died in a racing accident at the Hockenheimring in West Germany. During the 4-month gap between the first race, which Clark won, and the second race of the 78th Formula 1 season, it started in South Africa, drivers would compete in other racing formulas, and was normal this. Clark was originally slated to drive in the BOAC 1000 km sports car racer Brands Hatch, but instead chose to drive in the Deutschland Trophy, a Formula 2 race for Lotus at the Hockenheimring, primarily due to contractual obligation with Firestone tire supplier. Although the race has sometimes been characterized as a minor race meeting, the entry list was impressive, with top running Matras for the French driver Jean-Pierre Beltoise and Henri Pescarolo, Tecnos for Carlo Facetti and Clay Regazzoni, Team Brabhams for Derek Bell and Pierce Courage, a Ferrari for Chris Amon, and McLarens for Graham Lawrence and Robin Widdows. Team Lotus drivers Graham Hill and Jim Clark were in a gold leaf Team Lotuses, and a young Max Mosley, ex-president of FIA governing body, was also in the race, moving up from the Clubman Series. The event was run in 2 heats. On the 5th lap of the first heat, Clark's Lotus 48 veered off the track and crashed into the trees. He suffered a broken neck and skull fracture and died before reaching the hospital. The cause of the crash was never definitively identified, but investigators concluded it was most likely due to a deflating rear tire. Clark's death affected the racing community terribly, with fellow Formula One drivers and close friends Graham Hill, Jackie Stewart, Dan Gurney, John Surtees, Chris Amon and Jack Brabham all being personally affected by the tragedy. People came from all over the world to Clark's funeral. Colin Chapman was devastated and publicly stated that he had lost his best friend. The 1968 Formula One Drivers' Championship was subsequently won by his Lotus teammate Graham Hill, who pulled the heartbroken team together and held off Jackie Stewart for the crown, which he later dedicated to Jim Clark. There was initial speculation as to whether the accident was caused by a driver error or a deflating rear tire, and the Lotus was investigated thoroughly by aircraft crash investigators for 3 weeks. Many drivers, including John Surtees and Brabham, were convinced that the crash was caused by a deflating rear tire and were adamant that it was not a driver error, simply because they believed Clark was not capable of making such a mistake. According to Andrew Marriott of the classic journal Motorsport, who was covering the race as a young reporter, deaths in the sport were a regular occurrence in those days. But surely, someone of Clark's sublime talent and skill, people reckoned that the rear tire had deflated, and there is another theory that the mechanical metering unit of the Cosworth FVA engine had seized and caused Clark to crash. Nowadays, there is still a large memorial to Clark at Hockenheim, but because the track has been reduced in length and the old course reforested, the actual location of the crash is in a heavily wooded area. The legacy that Jim Clark left to us is that he achieved 33 pole positions and won 25 races from his 72 Grand Prix starts in championship races. He is remembered for his ability to drive and win in all types of cars and series, including a Lotus Cortina, with which he won the 1964 British Touring Car Championship, IndyCar, rallying, where he took part in the 1966 RAC Rally of Great Britain in a Lotus Cortina, and again within sports car races. He competed in the Le Mans 24 Hours race in 59, 60 and 61, finishing second in class in 59, driving a Lotus Elite, and finishing third overall in 1960, driving an Aston Martin DBR1. He took part in a NASCAR event, driving also a 7-liter Holman Moody Ford at the American 500 at the Banked Speedway at Rockingham on 29th of October 1967. He was also able to master difficult Lotus sports car prototypes, such as the Lotus 30 and 40. Clark had an ability to adapt to whichever car he was driving. Whilst other drivers would struggle to find a good car setup, Clark would usually set competitive lap times with whatever setup was provided and asked for the car to be left as it was. Clark wrote an autobiography which was published just after his first World Championship, titled Jim Clark at the Wheel. The book was updated after his Indy 500 victory. Sir Jackie Stewart said of what made Clark such a good driver: "He was so smooth, he was so clean, he drove with such finesse, he never bullied a racing car. He sort of caressed into doing the things he wanted it to do." When Jim Clark died, fellow driver Chris Amon said, "If it could happen to him, what chance do the rest of us have?" I think we all felt that. It seems like we had lost our leader. Clark is buried in the village of Chermside in Berwickshire. A memorial stone can be found at the Hockenheimring circuit, moved from the site of his crash to a location closer to the current track, and a life-size statue of him in racing overalls stands by the bridge over a small stream in the village of his birth, Kilmany in Fife. A small museum, which is known as the Jim Clark Room, can be found in Dons. The Jim Clark Trophy was introduced in the 1987 Formula One season for drivers of cars with naturally aspirated engines, but was discontinued after turbocharged engines were restricted in 1988 and dropped for 1989 season of Formula One, when all cars, by rules, had to have non-turbo engines. The Jim Clark Memorial Award is an annual award given by the Association of Scottish Motoring Writers to Scots who have contributed significantly to transport and motorsport. The Jim Clark Rally is an annual event held in Berwickshire. Clark was an inaugural inductee into the Scottish Sports Hall of Fame in 2002. What is left in my memory about Jim Clark is that was the personal hero of someone that we are going to remember in a couple of days from now, named Ayrton Senna. And it's not just Ayrton Senna about it. We can take the words of Cedric Selzer: if you have come second, you have lost, winning the World Championship with Jim Clark. Quotes: there have been many stories about the tires on Jim Clark's car lasting 4 races. This is true, but also the brake pads lasted 3 times longer than those of any other driver. Derek Wilde used to say that you could put all the gearboxes on the bench in front of him in random order, and he could tell which gearbox came out of Jim's car, as it showed less signs of wear. The point is that the standard of preparation was not different between Jim's car and the number 2 car. It was just that the man was very soft on his car, and so he tended to last the race distance as a result, despite, I personally add, being the quickest on track. A particular skill that few years later, we would have seen with Jackie Stewart and Niki Lauda.